The wind had teeth, and for 3 months it had done nothing but bite. Silas Kane felt its edge even through his worn sheepskin coat, a familiar gnawing that had worked its way past the fabric and into his bones. The cattle drive from Montana had been a special kind of hell, a relentless trial of ice-crusted rivers and snow-blinded days where the sky was a sheet of dirty pewter and the horizon was a lie. He'd lost 3 steers to a frozen bog, a good horse to a broken leg, and a piece of himself to the biting solitude. The same piece he lost every winter and had to find again in the spring thaw. As his gelding, Boulder, picked a careful path up the final ridge, Silas saw the thin curl of smoke he'd been picturing for 1,000 miles. His own. The sight should have brought relief, a loosening in his chest. Instead, a knot of unease tightened in his gut. The smoke was too thin, too hesitant for a chimney that had been cold for months. He hadn't left a fire burning. He nudged Boulder into a slow trot, his hand resting on the stock of the Winchester in its scabbard. The cabin looked the same from a distance. A squat, solid shape of hand-hewn logs hunkered against the ponderosa pines, as stubborn and lonely as he was. But as he drew closer, the details sharpened into a picture of violation. The door, thick oak he'd hung himself, was splintered near the latch, hanging crookedly on its leather hinges. It was ajar, a dark, gaping mouth in the face of his home. Silas swung down from the saddle before Boulder had even stopped moving, his boots sinking into the wet, half-melted snow. He drew the rifle, his movements fluid and economical, all the wasted motion worn away by years of caution. The air was still, holding the damp scent of pine and thawing earth. There was no sound but the drip of water from the eaves and the weary sigh of his horse. He pushed the door open with the barrel of the rifle. The inside of the one-room cabin was chaos, not the violent, destructive chaos of a grizzly, but the methodical, ugly chaos of a man searching for something specific. His flour and sugar sacks had been slit open, their contents a pale dust over the rough planked floor. The mattress on his cot was slashed, straw guts spilling onto the dirt. The few books he owned were tossed from their shelf, their pages bent and broken. Even the stones of the hearth had been pried at, soot smudging the wood floor in gritty fingerprints. Silas stepped inside, his eyes cataloging the damage with a cold, detached fury. He was not a man of many possessions. He had his horse, his saddle, his guns, and this cabin. Whoever had done this had been looking for something more. Money, perhaps, or a deed. They would have been disappointed. He kept his money on him, and the only thing he owned outright was the trouble that seemed to find him. His gaze fell upon a small object half hidden under the overturned mattress, ticking. A small, wooden bird, whittled from a piece of aspen, its surface worn smooth by the touch of hands. He bent down and picked it up, his thumb stroking the familiar curve of its wing. Sarah had loved it. She had said it reminded her of the bluebirds that nested in the eaves every spring. Holding the bird, the cold cabin dissolved, and he was standing in the heat of a different day. 7 years passed. The air had been thick with the smell of smoke, but it was not wood smoke. It was the greasy, black smoke of ruin. He had been away for 2 days, selling pelts in Haven's Folly, and he'd come home to silence. The chickens were gone, the corral gate was open, and the door to the cabin was swinging in the hot, dry wind. Inside, the scene had been worse. Not just a search, but a slaughter. Sarah was on the floor, near the hearth where she'd been making bread. The flour was everywhere then, too, like a shroud of snow, clinging to the dark stain that spread out from beneath her. She had been with child, their first, a new life that had been a fragile bloom of hope in his own barren world. The bandits had taken everything. The few dollars he'd left her, the salted meat, the 2 good blankets from their bed. And they had taken her. They had taken the future. The guilt was a physical thing, a branding iron he pressed to his own soul every morning. He should have been there. He should have never left her alone. He had built this cabin with his own hands to keep her safe. And in the end, It had been her tomb. From that day forward, a new code had settled over him, hard and unforgiving as winter granite. He had failed the one person he was sworn to protect. He would not fail another. It was why he stepped in when men got too rough in town, why he'd tracked down the gang that hit the stagecoach last fall. Not for the reward, but for the quiet satisfaction of seeing justice done. He was a keeper of accounts, settling debts for the helpless because he could never settle his own. He closed his fist around the wooden bird, the memory receding, leaving behind the familiar ache. He swept the spilled flour out the door, righted his small table and chair, and began the slow, methodical process of putting his world back in order, his face an unreadable mask of stone. At that same moment, a young woman calling herself Eliza Cole stepped off the morning stage into the muddy main street of Haven's Folly. The town was a sorry collection of false-fronted buildings clinging to the side of a stripped-out mountain, a place that had run out of gold and was slowly running out of hope. Lena Whitmore, for that was her real name, pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, trying to make herself small and invisible. It was a skill she had learned early in her father's house. She carried a single carpet bag with everything she owned, 2 dresses, a brush, a bar of soap, and a small, worn Bible she could no longer bring herself to open. She was looking for work, any work that was honest. Laundry, mending, scrubbing floors, anything to earn enough for a meal and a room that was not on the street. She started at the general store, but the proprietor's wife took one look at her tired face and the desperation in her eyes and shook her head. "Nothing for you here." The woman's voice was not unkind, but it was firm, final. It was the same at the boarding house and the small eatery. They saw a young woman, alone, with no luggage to speak of and no references to offer. And they saw trouble. As she walked away from the mercantile, she felt the weight of whispers at her back. 2 women, bundled in wool coats, stopped their conversation to watch her pass, their heads bent together like crows on a fence rail. "That's her," one murmured, just loud enough for Lena to hear. "The preacher's daughter from over the ridge." "Whitmore's girl," the other whispered, a note of scandalous delight in her voice. "The one who ran off." In the middle of the night, they say she's tainted. You know what his sermons were like, all fire and brimstone about the sins of women. And his own daughter turns out to be a stray. Lena's cheeks burned with a shame that was not her own. Her father, the Reverend Thaddeus Whitmore, was a man who saw sin in every shadow and the devil's hand in every woman's smile. His sermons could peel the paint from the church walls, filled with booming condemnations of impure thoughts and wayward flesh. He had ruled his home with the same iron fist, and Lena had grown up under the cold shadow of his righteousness, where a simple laugh could be twisted into a sign of vanity, and a moment of quiet contemplation was evidence of a dark and secretive heart. She had not run because she was tainted. She had run because she was terrified. She had run from a future that felt like being buried alive. An arranged marriage to a deacon 3 times her age, a man whose damp hands and pious pronouncements made her skin crawl. The arrangement was meant to seal a deal, to silence a scandal that had nothing to do with her, and she had chosen the unknown dangers of the world over the certain damnation of that union. But the world, she was quickly learning, was not a kind place for a woman alone. By late afternoon, her hope had worn as thin as the soles of her shoes. The only door left was the one she'd been avoiding all day, the one with the swinging doors and the sound of a tinny piano spilling out into the street, the Gilded Cage Saloon. Taking a deep breath that did little to steady her trembling hands, she pushed through the doors. The place smelled of stale whiskey, sweat, and sawdust. A few miners hunched over the bar, and a game of cards was underway in the corner. A man with a greasy apron and a fat, florid face looked up from behind the bar. He was Jedediah Barlow, the owner. "What do you want, girl?" he asked, his eyes traveling over her with a dismissive, yet assessing, gaze. "I'm looking for work," Lena said, her voice barely a whisper. "I can clean. I'll do anything." Barlow grunted, wiping a glass with a dirty rag. He was about to send her away when his son, Jed Jr., a wiry young man with his father's cruel eyes and a permanent smirk, sauntered over. "Now hold on, Pa," Jed said, his gaze lingering on Lena's face. "She's got 2 hands. We could always use someone to mop up the filth around here." He looked directly at Lena. "You ain't too proud to scrub floors, are you?" Lena shook her head, hating the way he looked at her, but hating the gnawing emptiness in her stomach more. "No, sir." And so, she was hired. Her job was to sweep the floors, empty the spittoons, and wash the glasses. The pay was a pittance, barely enough for a bed in the tiny, windowless room above the saloon, and 1 meal a day. The real price was the harassment. It started immediately. The miners, emboldened by drink, would make crude comments as she passed. A hand would drop to her shoulder or the small of her back, lingering just a moment too long. She learned to move quickly, to keep her eyes down, to become a ghost in the rowdy, smoke-filled room. But Jed Barlow was relentless. He seemed to enjoy tormenting her, cornering her in the storeroom or by the back door, his voice a low, suggestive drawl in her ear. "You're a pretty little thing for a preacher's girl," he'd say. "Bet you got some fire under all that starch." Lena lived in a state of constant, humming fear. She worked from noon until the last drunk was thrown out into the night, and then she would climb the stairs to her small, dark room, barricade the door with her only chair, and lie awake, listening to the sounds of the saloon dying below her. It came to a head on a Saturday night. The saloon was crowded, the air thick and suffocating. Lena was carrying a heavy tray of dirty glasses back to the bar when Jed stepped directly into her path. She tried to sidestep him, but he blocked her way. "Where you hurrying off to, Eliza?" he sneered, using the name she'd given. "I have work to do," she said, her eyes fixed on the floor. "Look at me when I'm talking to you," he snapped, his hand shooting out to grab her arm. His grip was tight, his fingers digging into her flesh. Something inside Lena, a cord of fear and submission that had been stretched taut for weeks, for years, finally snapped. All the whispered sermons, the cold judgments, the leering eyes and unwanted touches coalesced into a single, blinding point of rage. She dropped the tray. Glasses shattered on the floor. With her free hand, she snatched an empty whiskey bottle from a nearby table. She brought it down hard against the edge of the bar. The bottle exploded with a sharp crack, leaving the jagged neck clutched in her hand. Without a second of hesitation, she thrust the broken glass toward Jed's face. "Don't you touch me," she hissed, her voice low and shaking with an intensity that surprised even herself. Jed recoiled, his smirk vanishing, replaced by a flicker of genuine fear. The saloon went quiet. The piano stopped. Every eye was on them. The sheriff, a weary man named Coulter, pushed his way through the crowd. "What's all this?" he demanded, his gaze taking in the scene. The terrified girl with the broken bottle, the owner's son with his hands raised, the shattered glass on the floor. "She tried to kill me," Jed yelped, his bravado returning now that the law was present. "The crazy girl just attacked me for no reason." "He grabbed me," Lena said, her voice trembling but firm. Sheriff Coulter sighed. It was her word against Jed Barlow's. In Haven's Folly, that was no choice at all. "Put the bottle down. Miss," he said, his tone tired. "You're coming with me, disturbing the peace." In a dark corner of the saloon, Silas Kane sat nursing a single whiskey. He had come to town for supplies, salt, coffee, cartridges, and had stopped in for a drink before the long ride back. He had seen the whole thing. He had been watching the girl since she started working here a week ago. He had seen the way the men looked at her, the way Jed Barlow circled her like a coyote. He saw not a tainted woman, but a cornered animal, all teeth and desperation. He watched as Coulter gently took the broken bottle from Lena's unresisting hand and led her toward the door. As they passed, Silas stood up. He walked over to the sheriff, his movements calm and deliberate. "Coulter," he said, his voice a low rumble. The sheriff stopped. "Silas, don't need any trouble from you tonight." "There won't be any," Silas said. "What's the fine for disturbing the peace?" Coulter looked from Silas to the girl, then back again. $5. Silas reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of coins, counting out $5 onto the scarred surface of a nearby table. "Her fine is paid," he said. "Let her go." He turned and walked out of the saloon without another word, without a single glance at Lena. He mounted Boulder and rode out of town, melting into the growing dusk. Lena stood frozen, watching him go, having no idea that the silent, grim-faced man had just intervened on her behalf. Sheriff Coulter cleared his throat. "Go on, girl. Get out of here. And I suggest you don't come back." Lena didn't need to be told twice. She fled, not even daring to go upstairs for her bag. She just ran out of the saloon and into the street, with no destination in mind, only the desperate need to put Haven's Folly behind her. Just as she cleared the last buildings of the town, the sky opened up. A cold spring storm that had been threatening all day finally broke, unleashing a torrential downpour. The rain came down in hard, driving sheets, turning the dirt road into a slick, grasping mud that sucked at her shoes. The temperature plummeted. Within minutes, she was soaked to the skin, her thin dress clinging to her like a second, icy flesh. Her hand, which she'd cut on the bottle without realizing it, throbbed with a dull, persistent pain. She stumbled on, blinded by the rain and the darkness, driven by a fear that was greater than the storm. She did not know where she was going. She only knew she could not go back. The road climbed, winding up into the pine-covered hills that surrounded the valley. The wind howled through the trees, a mournful, lonely sound. Hours passed. Her body, already weakened by hunger and exhaustion, began to fail her. A violent shiver took hold, racking her from head to toe. Her steps became clumsy, her thoughts blurred and indistinct. She was going to die out here. The thought came to her with a strange, calm certainty. And then she saw it, through the swirling curtain of rain, a faint, flickering light, a single yellow window, a beacon of impossible warmth in the vast, cold darkness. A cabin. Hope, sharp and painful, lanced through her. She left the muddy road, stumbling through the underbrush, her arms outstretched toward the light as if she could pull herself toward it. She tripped over a root, falling hard, the breath knocked out of her. For a moment, she lay there in the mud and pine needles, the will to go on completely gone, but the light was still there, so close. She crawled the last few feet, pulling herself up onto the rough wood of a porch. She managed to raise a fist and bang it once, twice, on the solid wood of the door before her strength gave out entirely. The world tilted, the yellow light of the window dissolving into blackness as she collapsed in a heap on the threshold. Inside, Silas Kane was startled from his thoughts by the sound. He had been sitting by the fire, cleaning his rifle. The cabin finally restored to his Spartan sense of order. He stood, grabbing the Winchester, and moved to the door. He peered through the small peephole he had drilled for just such an occasion. All he could see was a dark, sodden shape slumped against the wood. He opened the door a crack. The wind and rain drove in, carrying the scent of wet pine. He saw the woman, her face pale and streaked with mud, her hair plastered to her skull. He recognized her instantly. The girl from the saloon. His first instinct, sharp and visceral, was to close the door. Trouble. He had felt it in the saloon, and here it was, washed up on his doorstep. This was not his concern. He wanted nothing to do with her or the mess she had made in town. He had built his life around solitude, a fortress against the kind of pain that came with connection. She was a breach in the walls. He started to push the door shut, But then he saw her hand, cut and bleeding sluggishly into the rain. He saw the violent, uncontrollable shiver that shook her small frame. He saw the utter and complete surrender of a body that had reached its absolute limit. And he heard an echo, a ghost of a memory from a smoky, blood-stained room. I should have been there. His code, the one he had written in his wife's blood, would not allow this. He could not turn away someone so clearly in need, not without becoming the very thing he despised. With a low curse that was lost in the wind, he swung the door wide. The trouble had arrived, and he was letting it in. He bent down, scooped the unconscious girl into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, and carried her inside, kicking the door shut against the storm. He laid her on the cot, the only soft place in the cabin, and for a moment he was frozen by the foreignness of it. A woman in his bed. The thought was a trespass, a sacrilege. He quickly stripped the single wool blanket from it and carried her, stiff and awkward, in his arms, to the hearth. He settled her on the floor before the fire, resting her head on his rolled-up saddle blanket. Her clothes were a sodden, muddy ruin, and he knew if he left her in them, the fever would take her before morning. His hands, calloused and clumsy from years of handling the rope and iron, fumbled with the tiny buttons of her dress. He worked with a grim, detached purpose, his eyes fixed on the ceiling beams, trying to separate the task from the person. He got the wet dress off, along with her thin underthings, leaving her in nothing but a simple chemise that was just as soaked. He worked quickly, his movements efficient, his face set like stone. He wrapped her in the dry, rough wool of the blanket from his bed, and then another he pulled from his chest. The cut on her hand was deeper than he'd thought, a ragged gash across her palm filled with dirt. He fetched the small tin of supplies he kept on the mantel, the same one he used for himself or his horse with equal impartiality. He cleaned the wound with whiskey, ignoring her soft moan as the alcohol bit into the raw flesh. He stitched it closed with a steady hand, the needle and thread moving with a practiced precision that belied the tremor he felt deep in his gut. He wrapped the hand in clean strips of an old shirt, the white of the bandage a stark contrast to her mud-stained skin. He spent the rest of the night in his rocking chair, the rifle across his lap, watching her sleep. The fire cast flickering shadows across her face, a face that looked impossibly young and worn out all at once. He saw the faint bruising on her arm where Jed Barlow had grabbed her. He saw the exhaustion etched into the lines around her mouth. He saw a world of hurt that he wanted no part of, a world of trouble he had just invited across his threshold. When dawn broke, gray and weeping, she was awake. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sky, followed his every movement as he stoked the fire and put a pot of coffee on to boil. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice a dry rasp. "My cabin," he said, not turning from the fire. "You collapsed on the porch." She struggled to sit up, clutching the wool blanket around her. She looked down at herself, then at the pile of her wet, ruined clothes near the door. A flush of color rose in her pale cheeks. "Did you?" "Your clothes were soaked. You'd have been dead by morning," he said flatly, cutting her off. He poured coffee into a tin mug and handed it to her. "Drink this." She took it, her bandaged hand awkward, her fingers trembling. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, broken only by the hiss of the fire and the steady drumming of rain on the roof. "I don't have a name for you," he said finally, his back still to her. "Eliza," she lied, the name tasting like ash in her mouth. "Eliza Cole." He grunted, a non-committal sound. He knew it was a lie. He did not care. A false name was just another wall, and he was happy to have as many walls between them as possible. When she was steady on her feet, he pointed to a clean shirt and a pair of his old trousers folded on the wood box. "Those will have to do until your things are dry. The barn is warm and out of the rain. You can stay there until the road is passable." He did not offer her the cabin. He could not. The cabin was Sarah's. Every log, every stone held the ghost of her touch, her laugh, To let this stranger, this Eliza, inhabit that space felt like a betrayal he was not willing to make. The barn was shelter, the cabin was a sanctuary, and its saint was dead. She nodded, her eyes downcast. "Thank you," she whispered. He just shrugged, turning away to stare out the window at the relentless rain. "I'd have done it for a stray dog." The days that followed were a study in silence. Lena, for she was Lena in her own mind, not this phantom Eliza, moved into the barn. It was a good barn, solid and clean, smelling of hay and horse and leather. He'd given her 2 more blankets, and she made a bed for herself in the hayloft. Her life fell into a strange, new rhythm, dictated by the man in the cabin. He would leave a plate of food for her on a stump between the 2 buildings, usually stew or beans, always hot. He said nothing when he left it, and she said nothing when she retrieved it. They were like 2 wary animals circling a shared territory, careful not to get too close. She watched him from the barn door. He moved with a quiet purpose, his days filled with the small, necessary tasks of a solitary life. He chopped wood, his axe rising and falling with a steady, hypnotic rhythm. He cleaned his guns, his hands moving with an unsettling familiarity over the steel. He spoke to his horse, Boulder, in a low, gentle murmur that was softer than any tone she had ever heard him use with her. He was a closed book, its cover worn and its pages locked tight. She was grateful, a deep, aching gratitude that sat heavy in her chest. But she was also terrified. She did not know what he wanted from her, what price he would eventually demand for his charity. Men always wanted something. Her father had wanted piety and obedience. Jed Barlow had wanted something else entirely. This man, Silas Kane, was a mystery. And in her experience, mysteries were just dangers you had not yet identified. The rain finally broke after 4 days, leaving behind a world washed clean and a sky of brilliant, aching blue. The roads were still a mess of mud, but Silas knew he had to go to town. His supplies were low, and the solitude he craved had been so thoroughly broken that the quiet of his own mind was now louder than any conversation. He saddled Boulder, his movements stiff. As he rode past the barn, she was standing in the doorway, a small, forlorn figure in his oversized shirt. "The road should be clear in another day or 2, he said, pulling the horse to a stop. It was the most he had spoken to her in a single stretch. She just nodded, clutching her arms around herself. He rode away without another word, the unease in his gut a hard, cold knot. He had planned to leave her here, to go to town and return, and then she would be gone, and his life would settle back into its familiar, empty shape. But the thought of leaving her alone, defenseless, gnawed at him. The men who had torn apart his cabin were still out there somewhere. And then there was the trouble she had stirred up in Haven's Folly. The town was buzzing with it. As he tied Boulder to the hitching post outside the general store, he heard her name, the false one, Eliza, on the lips of 2 men lounging on the boardwalk. "Brought a bottle to Jed Barlow's face." "She did," one was saying, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the mud. "Crazy as a loon." "Heard she was the runaway preacher's girl," the other added. "They say she's been with half the men in the next county. No wonder old Jedediah ran her off." Silas's jaw tightened. He pushed past them into the store, his presence silencing their conversation. He bought his supplies, flour, coffee, salt, cartridges, and paid the proprietor, a man named Henderson, who eyed him with a new, calculating curiosity. "That girl you paid the fine for," Henderson said, his voice low. "She causing you any trouble?" "No trouble," Silas said, his voice flat, a clear warning to drop the subject. But as he was loading his saddlebags, Jed Barlow Jr. stepped out of the saloon. The smirk was back on his face, uglier than before. Well, look what the storm washed in," Jed drawled, leaning against a post. "Come to bring your new pet some food?" Silas finished tying the leather straps on his saddlebag, his movements slow and deliberate. He turned to face Jed, his eyes cold and devoid of any emotion. "You stay away from her," he said. The words were quiet, but they carried the weight of a death sentence. Jed laughed, a high, nervous sound. "Why? You lay some kind of claim on her? Cain didn't take you for a man who picks up the town's trash? Or is it true what they say, that you ain't been right since your wife?" Jed never finished the sentence. In 2 long strides, Silas had him by the front of his shirt, lifting him onto his toes and slamming him back against the wooden post. The smirk vanished from Jed's face, replaced by wide-eyed terror. Silas's face was inches from his, a mask of cold fury. "You will not speak my wife's name," Silas whispered, his voice a raw, dangerous thing. "And if I ever see you within a mile of my land, or if I hear that you have so much as looked in that girl's direction again, I will finish what she started with that bottle. Do you understand me?" Jed could only manage a choked, frantic nod. Silas held him there a moment longer, letting the fear sink in, then released him. Jed stumbled back, gasping for air, and scrambled back into the safety of the saloon. Silas swung himself up onto Boulder and rode out of town, the anger a hot, bitter taste in his mouth. The boy's words echoed in his head. Claim on her. The idea was absurd, insulting. He was just trying to keep a promise to a ghost. That was all. When he returned, Lena was not waiting in the barn. He found her by the woodpile, his axe in her hands. Splitting kindling, she was clumsy at it, her swings awkward. But she worked with a grim determination that surprised him. "What are you doing?" he asked, swinging down from his horse. She jumped at the sound of his voice, dropping the axe. "I have to earn my keep," she said, her chin jutting out with a defiance he hadn't seen before. "I won't be a burden." "You'll take your hand off," he grumbled, gesturing to her bandaged palm. But he did not tell her to stop. Instead, he watched her. He saw the way she gathered the split wood and stacked it neatly, the way she mended a broken rail on the corral fence using a length of discarded wire, her fingers nimble and sure. There was a competence to her, a knowledge of survival that did not fit the image of a helpless girl. He found it unsettling. It hinted at a past that was even harder than the one he had imagined for her. She was not some fragile flower. She was a stubborn weed, determined to grow in the hardest of soils. Their uneasy truce began to change after that. It was a slow, almost imperceptible thaw. One night, a week after her arrival, he was woken by a scream. It was not a sound of terror, but of pure, unadulterated agony, a sound that ripped through the quiet of the night and went straight to his soul. He grabbed his pistol and was out the door in a heartbeat, his mind racing. Bandits. The men from the cabin. He burst into the barn, the gun raised, his eyes searching the moonlit shadows. He found her in the hayloft, thrashing in her sleep, her hands batting at some unseen enemy. "No!" she cried, her voice muffled by the blankets. "The fire! Don't lock it! Please! I can't breathe!" He froze on the ladder, the words hitting him like a physical blow. Fire! Locked in! He lowered the pistol, the immediate threat of physical danger replaced by the chilling presence of a deeper, older wound. He did not go to her. He did not touch her or try to wake her. He understood, in a way he could not articulate, that this was a place he could not follow, a fight she had to have on her own. He retreated to the bottom of the ladder and simply stood there, a silent, helpless guard, until her cries subsided into ragged sobs and, finally, into a troubled silence. He did not pry the next morning. He did not ask. But something had shifted between them. She had shown him a glimpse of her brokenness, and he had not run away. The small moments began after that. He started making enough coffee for 2 in the morning, leaving the second tin cup on the porch railing for her. Sometimes she would be there, huddled in his old coat, and they would drink in silence, watching the sun burn the mist off the mountains. It was not conversation, but it was a kind of communion. One afternoon, a summer storm rolled in, the sky turning a bruised purple. Instead of retreating to their separate shelters, they both stood and watched it. He from the porch and she from the barn door. The lightning was magnificent, spider-webbing across the sky, followed by the low, guttural rumble of thunder that vibrated in their chests. For a moment, they were not a man and a woman in an impossible situation, but just two small creatures watching the awesome, impartial power of the world. He found himself talking to her, the words coming out before he could stop them. He told her about the horses, how Boulder favored his left side, how to read the flick of an ear or the switch of a tail. She listened, her attention absolute, and when they brushed the horses down that evening, they worked together in a comfortable, silent rhythm, the rasp of the currycombs a language all its own. His routine was no longer his. It now had a new, unsettling orbit. He found himself looking for her, noting her absence or her presence. The silence of the cabin felt different, deeper, more pronounced, because he knew she was just 100 feet away. He was a man who had built a fortress of solitude, and now he found that the walls had a window, and he could not stop himself from looking through it. Late one night, returning from checking his trap lines along the creek, he saw that the light from his cabin window was out. He assumed she had gone back to the barn for the night, but as he stepped onto the porch, he saw her. She had fallen asleep in his rocking chair, the one he had built for Sarah, the one he rarely sat in himself anymore because the memories it held were too sharp. She was curled up like a child, her head resting against the high back. She must have been cold, because she had pulled his heavy sheepskin coat, which he'd left hanging on a peg by the door, over herself, like a blanket. He stopped, his hand on the door latch. Every instinct told him to wake her, to send her back to the barn where she belonged. This was a line. This was his space, Sarah's space, but he could not bring himself to do it. The moonlight softened the hard lines of exhaustion on her face, making her look peaceful, vulnerable. The sight did not stir anger or resentment in him. It stirred something else, something he had not felt in 7 years, a quiet, protective ache that settled deep in his chest. He stood there for a long time, a silent guardian in the darkness, watching her breathe. Then, without making a sound, he turned, opened the cabin door, and went inside, leaving her to sleep in the moonlight, wrapped in his coat, in his chair, on the edge of his world. He did not wake her. The hard edges of spring softened into the long, warm days of summer. The last of the snow vanished from the high peaks, and the mountain meadows exploded with paintbrush and columbine. The change of seasons mirrored the slow, imperceptible shift in the small world of the cabin. Lena no longer slept in the barn. One evening, after a particularly violent thunderstorm had shaken the valley, Silas had found her huddled just inside the barn door, her face pale. He had said nothing, merely gestured with his head toward the cabin. She had followed, and from then on, she slept on a pallet of blankets he'd laid out for her on the floor near the hearth. Their silence was different now. It was no longer the wary, brittle silence of strangers, but the comfortable, breathing silence of two people who had grown accustomed to the shape of each other's presence. They ate their meals together at the small table, the scrape of forks on tin plates a kind of conversation. He taught her how to track, how to read the signs of a passing deer or a hidden covey of quail. In return, she brought a quiet order to the cabin's interior, mending his shirts with neat, tiny stitches and finding ways to make their meager supplies last. She discovered a patch of wild mint by the creek and would sometimes make a weak tea, the fresh, clean scent. A welcome change from the constant bitterness of coffee. He found himself watching her, studying the way a stray piece of hair would catch the light, the focused set of her jaw when she was concentrating on a task, the quick, unguarded smile that would sometimes appear when Boulder nudged her for a piece of apple. These small observations were like stones dropped into the still, deep well of his solitude, the ripples spreading wider each day. He was a man who had forgotten what it felt like to share a life, and the memory, returning in small, sharp jolts, was both a comfort and a torment. One morning, as she was sweeping the hearth, she paused and looked at the small, rough-hewn table he used as a nightstand next to his cot. On it, next to a tin of gun oil and a stack of cartridges, lay a small, silver locket, tarnished with age. It was the only decorative object in the entire cabin. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice soft. "Was it your mother's?" Silas, who was cleaning a rabbit by the door, went still. His hand stopped moving. The silence that fell was the old kind, the hard, cold kind. He did not look at her. He simply resumed his work, his knife moving with a sharp, brutal efficiency. The question hung in the air between them, unanswered, until it finally withered and died. Lena lowered her gaze, a faint flush of shame on her cheeks, and went back to her sweeping. She did not ask again. Days later, they were walking the ridge above the cabin, checking his snares. They came to a clearing where a doe and a new, spotted fawn were drinking from a small spring. They froze, watching the scene. The fawn, all spindly legs and wide, curious eyes, stayed close to its mother's side. There was a fragile, perfect peace to the moment. Lena let out a soft, unconscious sigh. Silas's face hardened. He turned and started walking back the way they came, his pace abrupt. Lena hurried to catch up. "What is it?" she asked, sensing the sudden storm in him. He walked on, his shoulders rigid. Finally, he stopped and spoke, his voice a low, rough thing, as if the words were being torn from his throat. "It was my wife's," he said. Lena stopped, confused. The locket?" He nodded, his eyes fixed on some distant point in the trees, a point 7 years in the past. Her name was Sarah. He spoke the name like a prayer he had forgotten how to say. "A raid, gang of men coming up from the south. I was in town, selling pelts. Should have been gone one day, but a storm held me up." He finally looked at her, and his eyes were hollow, filled with a bleakness that made her heart ache. "She was with child. They took everything, and they left her on the floor. I didn't get back in time. I built this place to keep her safe, and I wasn't here when she needed me." The confession was stark, brutal, stripped of any comfort. It was a raw wound, held open for her to see. He had not shared his grief. He had simply exposed it, a testament to his own failure. Lena felt tears well in her eyes, not just for the woman she had never known, but for the man standing before her, a man so consumed by guilt that he had turned himself to stone. She did not touch him. She did not offer empty words of comfort. She simply stood there, a witness to his pain, until he seemed to come back to himself. He blinked, the emptiness in his eyes receding, replaced by the familiar, guarded mask. He turned and continued walking, and she followed, the unspoken tragedy settling between them, a new, somber thread in the tapestry of their connection. That night, the air in the cabin was thick with ghosts. They sat by the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on the log walls. His vulnerability had given her a strange sort of courage. If he could show her his wounds, perhaps she could show him hers. "My father is a preacher," she began, her voice barely a whisper. He looked up from the harness he was mending, his expression unreadable. "He preaches about the weakness of women, the sin that lives in our hearts. He saw it everywhere, in a laugh, in a new ribbon for your hair, in a quiet moment spent looking out a window." She hugged her knees to her chest, her gaze fixed on the fire. "In his house, there was a cellar. It was cold and dark and smelled of damp earth, when a woman in his congregation was thought to have impure thoughts. He would take her there. My mother, my aunt, other women from the town. He would take his belt to them, to beat the sin out. He said he was saving their souls, Silas's hands, which had been methodically working the leather, were now perfectly still. When I was 16, Lena continued, her voice trembling slightly. A deacon in our church lost his wife, a man named Abner Croft. He was old, older than my father. He had damp hands. He was a holy man. My father said, pious. A few months ago, my father told me I was to be his new wife. I would turn 17 in the spring, and I was to be given to him. A gift, a righteous union. She finally looked at Silas, her eyes shimmering in the firelight. That's why I ran. Not because I was with a man, not for any of the reasons the gossips in town would imagine. She took a shaky breath, and the next words came out in a rush, a confession that was harder, more terrifying than any story of violence. I've never been touched by a man, not ever, not like that. She saw a flicker of surprise in his eyes, and she hurried to explain, a desperate need to make him understand. It wasn't because of my father's rules. It was because I was afraid. I never saw a man who didn't want something, who didn't look at you like he was figuring up a price. I never met one I could trust. Her confession hung in the air, a fragile, trembling thing. She had laid her own soul bare, offered him the deepest, most secret part of herself, the truth of her innocence, an innocence born not of piety, but of fear. Silas was visibly shaken. For the first time since she'd met him, the mask of stoicism slipped entirely. He looked at her as if he was seeing her for the first time. He saw not a runaway, not a problem, but a girl who had been so starved of kindness that she had mistaken basic human decency for a miracle. A muscle worked in his jaw. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. He slowly, deliberately, picked up the piece of harness and the awl, but his hands were no longer steady. The tension in the cabin, which had been a low hum of awareness, was now a palpable force, a live wire sparking between them. He was acutely aware of her, of the scent of mint and wood smoke that clung to her, of the rise and fall of her chest as she breathed. He wanted, with a fierce, desperate ache, to cross the small space between them, to touch her, to offer a comfort that went beyond words. But he hated himself for it. She was broken, damaged by the world, and his desire felt like another form of predation, another man wanting something from her. He was no better than the rest of them, so he did nothing. He gripped the leather until his knuckles were white and forced his attention back to his work, his self-control a physical battle. The world outside the cabin was not so still. Silas's trip to Haven's Folly had stirred the pot. The story of his confrontation with Jed Barlow had spread, twisted and embellished with each telling. Now, the whispers were different. They were no longer just about the runaway preacher's daughter. They were about the girl living with the quiet, dangerous cowboy on the mountain. Men in the saloon would stop talking when Silas entered. Their eyes would follow him, a mixture of fear, resentment, and a lewd, knowing curiosity. One afternoon, as he was riding home, he sensed he was being followed. He didn't look back. He simply guided Boulder off the main trail, onto a narrow game path that wound through a thick stand of aspen. He moved silently, his ears straining. He heard it then, the clumsy snap of a twig, the jingle of a bit. Whoever it was, they were not skilled at this. He dismounted in a dense grove of pines and waited. A few minutes later, a man from town, a miner named Griggs with a mean, stupid face, came riding through the aspens, his eyes scanning the trail ahead, a look of frustration on his face. Silas stepped out from behind a tree, his rifle held loosely in one hand. "You looking for something, Griggs?" he asked, his voice calm. Griggs jumped, his hand flying to the pistol on his hip. He froze when he saw the look in Silas's eyes. Just out for a ride. Kane," he stammered. "This is my land," Silas said, his voice dropping an octave. "Your ride is over. Turn around and go back to town. And tell the others who might be thinking of a similar ride that the air up here isn't healthy for trespassers." Griggs needed no more encouragement. He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, his panic making him reckless. Silas watched him go, a cold anger settling in his gut. The whispers were turning into action. It was only a matter of time before it escalated. He was quiet and grim when he returned to the cabin. Lena saw it immediately. She had learned to read the subtle shifts in his mood, the tightening of his jaw, the distance in his eyes. "What happened?" she asked, as he unsaddled Boulder. He did not answer, just continued with his task. "It's me, isn't it?" she said, her voice small. "I'm causing this trouble for you. Maybe I should leave. I can be gone by morning. You've done more than enough for me." It was an offer, but it was also a question, a test of the fragile, unspoken bond between them. Was she just a stray he had sheltered from a storm, or was she something more? Silas stopped what he was doing. He turned and looked at her, his gaze intense. He said nothing. The silence stretched, and Lena's heart sank. This was it. He was going to tell her to go, but he just turned back to the horse, pulling the saddle from its back and carrying it into the barn. That night, he did not mend harness or read from one of his worn books. He sat in the rocking chair, a position he rarely took, and began to sharpen his Bowie knife. He drew the long, heavy blade across the whetstone with slow, deliberate strokes. The sound filled the small cabin, a soft, rhythmic whisper of steel on stone. Shh, shh. It was a sound that spoke of preparation, of intent. It was the sound of a man getting ready for a fight. Lena watched him from her pallet, the firelight glinting off the polished blade. He had not spoken a word, but he had given her his answer. He was not sending her away. The final piece of the encroaching world arrived 2 days later. It came in the form of a nervous, weather-beaten trapper named Elias, who sometimes traded pelts with Silas. He rode up to the cabin late in the afternoon, his eyes darting around as if he expected trouble to jump from the trees. "Silas," he said, not dismounting. "Thought you should know. There's a preacher in town, a man named Gideon Blackwood from over the ridge. He's asking about a runaway girl, a preacher's daughter." Silas's face remained impassive, but Lena, who was standing in the doorway, felt a jolt of ice in her veins. "He's saying she's a sinner," Elias went on, his voice low and rushed. "A Jezebel who fled a righteous marriage. He's put up a notice in the saloon, a reward, $50 for her safe return to her family." Men are talking. "Silas, $50 is a lot of money in this town." Elias looked from Silas's stony face to the pale girl in the doorway and put the pieces together. "Lord have mercy," he whispered, and without another word, he spurred his horse and rode away, not wanting to be caught in the coming storm. The silence he left behind was heavy, suffocating, a reward, a price on her head. They had given her a name and a value, like a stray mare to be captured and returned to its owner. She looked at Silas, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was the end. He was a just man, a practical man. He could not fight a whole town. He could not fight the law of family and church. He finally turned to look at her, his expression grim. She braced herself for the words, for him to tell her it was over, that he had to hand her over. But all he said was, "Bolt the door." The bolted door changed everything. It was a simple bar of wood slid into 2 iron brackets, but it was the most profound boundary Lena had ever known. It separated the small, warm world of the cabin from the vast, cold wilderness that wanted to claim her. For the first time in her life, she felt something that resembled safety. It was a fragile, unfamiliar feeling, like a wild bird held gently in cupped hands. She had a roof that did not leak, a fire that did not die, and a man who stood between her and the world. But this new safety gave birth to a new and more terrifying kind of fear. In her father's house, fear had been a simple thing, fear of a raised hand, a locked door, a condemning verse of scripture. It was a fear of pain and punishment. This new fear was complex, a tangled knot in her stomach. It was the fear of what this safety meant and what it might become. She was acutely aware of Silas. The cabin was small, and his presence filled it entirely. She was aware of the breadth of his shoulders as he chopped wood, the quiet concentration on his face as he oiled his rifle, the way his hands, though rough and calloused, could be surprisingly gentle when tending to a horse's hoof. He was no longer just a protector, a grim guardian. He was a man, and she was a woman. The awareness was a low, constant hum beneath the surface of their quiet days. When he handed her a tin plate, their fingers would brush, and a jolt of heat, sharp and startling, would pass through her. When she woke in the night, she could hear the soft sound of his breathing from his cot across the room, a steady, living rhythm in the darkness. She found herself watching his mouth when he spoke the few words he offered, wondering what it would feel like. This new awareness terrified her. What if this safety she cherished was conditional? What if he was just being kind, fulfilling some rigid, personal code of honor, and he felt nothing more for her? Or worse, what if he did feel something, but he looked at her and saw only what the rest of the world saw, a tainted, runaway girl, damaged goods. The thought was a cold spike of shame in her heart. She had offered him her story, the truth of her innocence, but men had a way of not believing women. The question became a constant, silent refrain in her mind. What if he doesn't want me that way? The possibility of that rejection was more frightening than any reward posted in a saloon, because it would not be a rejection of her body, but of her soul, the very essence of who she was. One night, the air was warm and thick with a scent of pine and damp earth. The moon was a perfect silver dollar in a sky littered with stars. They had eaten their meal in silence, and now Silas was standing on the porch, staring up at the vast, indifferent heavens. Lena came to stand beside him, her arms wrapped around herself. The silence between them was charged, humming with all the things they had never said. She knew that if she did not speak, nothing would ever change. They would continue in this state of suspended animation until the world inevitably broke in and tore them apart. She had to take the risk. She had to know. "I'd let you touch me," she said, her voice so quiet it was almost carried away by the gentle night breeze. She did not look at him, but kept her eyes fixed on a distant, pulsing star. "If you wanted, if you ever did." The words hung in the still air, a raw and desperate offering. It was all she had to give. Not a promise of pleasure, but a testament of trust. "You are the one, the only one. I would not fear." Silas did not move. He did not speak. He did not even seem to breathe. For a long, agonizing moment, the world held its breath. Lena's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped thing. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he turned, and he walked away. He didn't go into the cabin. He walked off the porch and into the darkness of the trees, his footsteps fading into the chirping of the crickets. He left her standing there alone, the silver moonlight illuminating her shame. The rejection was absolute, more complete than any harsh word could have been. He had not even deemed her worthy of a response. She had offered him the most vulnerable part of herself, and he had simply walked away from it. She stood there until the cold of the night seeped into her bones. Then she retreated into the cabin, the warmth of the dying fire doing nothing to thaw the ice in her heart. She lay on her pallet, staring into the embers, feeling a fool. Of course he didn't want her. He was a good man, an honorable man, haunted by the ghost of a wife he had loved. He had saved her out of pity, out of a sense of duty, and she had mistaken that for something more. She had tried to turn his charity into affection, and she had soiled it. An hour later, a sound from the woods ripped through the night, a single gunshot. It was not the sharp crack of a hunting rifle, but the heavier boom of a pistol, and it was close, too close. Lena sat bolt upright, her heart seizing with a new kind of fear. It wasn't for herself. It was for him. He was out there. The cabin door opened, and Silas stepped inside. moving with a silent, predatory grace. In his hand, he held his Colt. His face was a thundercloud, his eyes dark and dangerous. "Get away from the window," he said, his voice a low growl. "What was that? Are you hurt?" she asked, her voice trembling. "It was a warning," he said, moving to the window and peering out into the darkness. "Someone trying to see if I was paying attention. They know you're here." The reality of their situation crashed down on her again. The reward. The men who were hunting her. It wasn't just a notice in a saloon anymore. It was a gunshot in the dark. It was real. And it was here. They were coming for her, and he was standing in their way. She looked at him, at his grim, determined face, at the gun held so steadily in his hand. He was going to fight for her. He had walked away from her touch, but he would not walk away from a threat against her life. The contradiction was a painful, confusing puzzle. The need to understand, to know where she stood before the world came crashing in, was overwhelming. She got to her feet and went to him. "Silas," she said, her voice shaking. He did not turn. He kept his watch on the dark woods. She reached out and touched his arm. He flinched, but did not pull away. "After this," she whispered, her words barely audible. "After they come, after the fight. What happens then?" She took a ragged breath and asked the question that held the weight of her entire world. "Will you still want me after tonight?" It was not the same question she had asked under the stars. That had been about desire. This was about survival. It was about the morning after, about the ruins and the blood and the consequences. When I am no longer a victim to be saved, when I am just a woman who has brought death to your door, will there be anything left for you to want? Silas didn't answer. He remained as still as the mountain, his gaze fixed on the darkness outside. His silence a wall she could not breach. The hope in her heart, which had flared so briefly, finally guttered and died, leaving behind only the cold ash of certainty. That night, sleep was an impossibility. Lena lay on her pallet, curled into a tight ball, listening to every creak of the cabin, every rustle of the wind. Silas did not go to his cot. He sat in the rocking chair, the rifle across his lap, his vigil unwavering. She could feel the force of his wakefulness, a palpable tension that filled the small room. He wanted her. The admission was a bitter self-indictment in the silence of his own mind. He wanted her with a raw, aching need that he had not felt since Sarah. He wanted to feel the silk of her hair, the warmth of her skin. He wanted to pull her into his arms and stand as a shield between her and all the horrors of the world. He wanted to hear his name on her lips in the darkness, and he hated himself for it. He hated the desire that coiled in his gut, because it felt like a weakness, a betrayal of the memory he had sworn to honor. He looked at her, at this girl who had been beaten and hunted and terrorized, and all he could see was a damaged, fragile thing. His wanting felt like a violation, another injury to a soul that had already suffered too much. He was a man of violence and guilt. What right did he have to touch something so broken? He would only shatter it further. So he sat in his chair, a guard for her body and a warden for his own heart, and did not answer her question. Morning came, gray and grim. The woods were quiet, too quiet. Silas had not moved from his chair. When the light was strong enough, he stood, his joints stiff, and went to the door. He unbolted it and stepped outside, his rifle at the ready, his eyes scanning the trees, the ridge, looking for any sign of movement. He saw nothing. The world was still. After a long moment, he came back inside, and he found the cabin empty. She was gone. Her pallet was neatly folded. On the table, where his plate would normally be, was a small, folded piece of paper, torn from the back page of one of his books. It was weighted down with a smooth, gray stone from the hearth. His heart, which he had thought was long dead, gave a single, painful lurch. He picked up the note. Her handwriting was neat, careful. "You've done enough." That was all it said. 2 words. A release, a judgment, an ending. He crumpled the paper in his fist. Foolish girl. He strode to the door and looked at the ground. A storm was rolling in from the west. The clouds, a dark, angry bruise on the horizon. But the earth was still soft from the last rain. And her footprints, small and hesitant, were clear. She was heading east, back toward the main trail, back toward town. She thought she was saving him. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed his saddlebags, a length of rope, and his slicker. Within minutes, he was on Boulder's back, the horse sensing the urgency, moving at a fast, ground-eating trot. The first drops of rain began to fall as he hit the trail, cold and sharp as needles. He tracked her easily at first, but as the rain intensified, turning the trail to a slick, running river of mud, the tracks became harder to read. He pushed on, his focus narrowed to a single point, finding her. He found her an hour later, in a small clearing a mile from the road. But she was not alone. A man had her by the arm, his face a mask of pious, self-righteous anger. He was an older man, stout, dressed in the severe black of a church deacon. It was Abner Croft. He must have been lying in wait, part of the group that had fired the warning shot. "You will come back with me, Lena," the deacon was saying, his voice a low, commanding rumble. "You will honor the agreement made by your father. You will be cleansed of your sin." "Let go of me," Lena cried, struggling against his grip. "I am your future husband," Croft said, his grip tightening. "You will learn to obey." Silas slid from the saddle, the rifle in his hands. "Let her go, old man," he said, his voice dangerously calm. Croft spun around, his eyes widening in surprise, then narrowing in contempt. He pulled Lena in front of him, a human shield. "This is not your concern, Cain. This is a family matter, a church matter. This girl belongs with her own kind." "She belongs with no one," Silas said, taking a slow step forward. "Now let her go." "She is a runaway," Croft sneered. "A sinner. I am saving her soul. There is a reward." He never finished. In that moment of distraction, Lena twisted, sinking her teeth into the fleshy part of his hand. Croft howled in pain and surprise, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was all Silas needed. He lunged forward, not with the rifle, but with his body, slamming his shoulder into the deacon and sending him stumbling back. Lena scrambled away, toward Silas. Croft, his face purple with rage, drew a small Derringer pistol from his coat pocket. Silas was faster. His own Colt was in his hand, the hammer already cocked. The deacon's shot went wide, the bullet thudding into a tree. Silas's shot did not. The heavy crack of the .45 echoed through the rain-soaked woods. Abner Croft staggered back, a look of profound surprise on his face. A dark, crimson flower bloomed on the front of his black coat. He looked down at it, then up at Silas, his mouth opening but no sound coming out. He collapsed into the mud, his eyes staring blankly at the weeping gray sky. Silence descended, broken only by the drumming of the rain. Lena stared at the body, her face ashen, her body trembling violently. Silas moved to her, grabbing her arm. "We have to go, now! The others will have heard the shot." He pulled her toward Boulder, swinging her up into the saddle and then mounting behind her. He kicked the horse into a gallop, not back toward the cabin, but deeper into the wilderness, away from the trails, away from the world of men. They rode for what felt like hours, the storm raging around them. Finally, as dusk began to bleed into the gray afternoon, he found what he was looking for, a shallow cave, a dark slash in a rock outcropping, hidden behind a thick curtain of ancient firs. He led the horse inside, then pulled Lena from the saddle. They were both soaked to the bone, chilled and exhausted. The adrenaline that had sustained them was gone, leaving behind a deep, shaking weariness. Lena huddled against the cold rock wall, her teeth chattering uncontrollably. The image of the dead man in the mud was burned into her mind. Silas built a small, smokeless fire from dry wood he found at the back of the cave. The small flames pushed back the darkness and the cold, but they could not push back the horror. Lena broke. A ragged sob tore from her throat. Then another, the fear, the relief, the guilt, the terror. It all came pouring out. She crawled across the small space to him, to the man who had just killed for her, and she threw her arms around his neck. She pressed her cold, trembling lips to his. It was not a kiss of passion, but of desperation, a frantic, raw collision of two broken souls in the dark. It was a thank you, a plea, a question, all at once. For a heartbeat, he was still, his body rigid. And then he recoiled. He gently but firmly pushed her away, his hands on her shoulders. She looked at him, her face a mess of tears and confusion, the rejection a fresh, brutal wound. He wouldn't meet her eyes. He stared into the fire, his face etched with a pain that seemed older and deeper than anything she could imagine. "Don't," he whispered, his voice hoarse, broken. "I'm not who you think I am. Love doesn't erase the pain, it just gives it a new name." The journey back to the cabin was a silent, sodden affair. The rain had lessened to a miserable drizzle that clung to them, and the world seemed rendered in shades of gray. Silas kept Boulder to the high ground, avoiding the trails, his eyes constantly scanning the trees. Lena sat behind him, her arms wrapped around his waist, her cheek pressed against the damp wool of his slicker. She did not hold on for warmth or comfort, but as a drowning person clings to a piece of driftwood. The image of Abner Croft falling into the mud was a permanent, searing brand on the inside of her eyelids. When they reached the cabin, the silence did not break. It followed them inside, settling between them, heavier than stone. He built up the fire while she stood shivering by the door, a ghost in his house. He gave her a dry blanket, and she wrapped it around herself, her movements stiff and mechanical. They did not speak of the man in the woods. They did not speak of the kiss in the cave. They did not speak at all. The events were a ghost in the room with them, a third presence that was too terrible to acknowledge. For weeks, they lived in this vacuum. Their days fell into a routine of empty rituals. He would hunt, chop wood, and patrol the perimeter of his land, his rifle always in hand. She would cook, clean, and mend, her hands moving with a purpose that her mind lacked. They were two people sharing a space, but each was trapped in a private, soundless prison. His rejection in the cave had built a wall between them as real as the log walls of the cabin. She had offered him her desperation, and he had handed it back to her, telling her that some wounds were too deep to ever be healed by another's touch. She understood, and she did not try again. She went back to sleeping on her pallet by the fire, the distance between her and his cot a vast, uncrossable chasm. The world outside, however, was not silent. The town of Haven's Folly had found its voice, and it was a chorus of condemnation. Silas did not need to go to town to hear it. It came to him. One morning, he found the top rail of his corral fence cut clean through. A few days later, a dead coyote was thrown over it, a crude warning. Justice in the West was a twisted, fickle thing, and it became even more so when the perceived honor of a woman was at the center of the storm. In the eyes of the town, Lena was not a victim who had fled a terrible fate. She was a temptress, a Jezebel who had lured a good man to his death and turned another, Silas Kane, into a killer. He was no longer the quiet, grim protector of the weak. He was the man hiding a sinner, a man who had chosen a tainted woman over the laws of church and community. The escalation came on a moonless night. Lena was woken by a strange, flickering orange light dancing outside the cabin's single window. Then came the smell, acrid and hungry. Smoke. She scrambled from her pallet and shook Silas awake. "The barn," she whispered, her voice tight with panic. He was on his feet in an instant, grabbing his rifle, They burst outside into a scene from hell. The barn, her first sanctuary, was completely engulfed in flames. The fire was a living, roaring beast, consuming the dry timbers with a terrible hunger, sending a geyser of sparks and embers into the black sky. Boulder, whom Silas had taken to tying closer to the cabin at night, whinnied in terror. There was nothing they could do but watch it burn, the heat scorching their faces even from 100 feet away. It was an act of war. They had not just sent a message, they had destroyed a part of his life, his home. They had taken away her last place of refuge. When the roof finally collapsed in a fiery cascade, sending a plume of red smoke toward the stars, something in Lena broke. The fear, which had been a constant, low hum, became a sharp, piercing shriek in her soul. That night, she could not bring herself to lie down on the floor. The floor felt exposed, vulnerable. Every shadow in the corner of the room seemed to menace her, to hold the shape of a man with a torch. She looked at Silas's cot, at the solid shape of him sitting on its edge, cleaning his pistol by the light of a single lantern. That small space, that narrow bed, seemed like the only safe harbor in the entire world. Without a word, she picked up her blankets and walked to the foot of his cot. She did not speak. She did not have to. Her wide, terrified eyes said everything. He looked at her, his face grim in the lantern light. Then at the small space beside him. He understood. This was not about desire. This was about survival. This was about a terror so profound that the only comfort was the physical presence of another human being, a solid anchor in a sea of fear. With a deep sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the world, he shifted over, making room. He turned down the edge of his own blanket in a silent invitation. She slid in, fully clothed, and lay as still as a stone, her back to him, careful that not a single part of her touched him. He lay on his back, his hands behind his head, staring up at the dark ceiling. The space between them was a truce line of wool and horsehair, a chasm of unspoken things. But for the first time in a long time, Lena's trembling began to subside. She was not alone in the dark. They slept like that for many nights. It became the new normal. Two solitary planets occupying the same small orbit, close enough to feel the pull of each other's gravity but never touching. The intimacy was one of shared breath, of the comfort of a nearby warmth against the cold dread of what the next day might bring. It was a closeness born not of passion, but of a shared siege. One night, she woke from a dream of fire. Her heart was pounding. Silas was asleep, his breathing deep and even. In the soft moonlight filtering through the window, she could see the faint, silvery trace of a scar on his side, disappearing under the edge of his undershirt. It was an old one, long and jagged, a roadmap of some past violence. Without thinking, driven by an impulse she did not understand, she reached out, her fingers, hesitant and trembling, lightly traced the raised line of flesh. He was so much more than the stone-faced man who presented himself to the world. He was a collection of wounds, visible and invisible, just as she was. He drew a sharp breath and his eyes opened, but he did not move. Her hand was still on his skin. "I want to know you," she whispered, her voice thick with a raw, aching sincerity. She was not just talking about the scar. All of you. It was another offering, different from the one she had made under the stars. This was not about her body, but about his soul. It was a plea to be let inside his walls, to be allowed to see the man behind the fortress. He closed his eyes, and a muscle worked in his jaw. The silence stretched, and in it, she felt his struggle. He was a man caught in a current, wanting to let himself be carried toward her but fighting with all his strength to swim for a lonely, barren shore. He did not speak. He did not pull away. But he did not respond. He simply lay there, letting her touch his scar. A silent, painful stalemate. He still didn't answer. The final warning came on horseback. Sheriff Coulter rode up to the cabin in the late afternoon. his face weary and etched with worry. He didn't dismount immediately, but sat on his horse, his gaze taking in the charred ruins of the barn. "Silas," he said, his voice grim. Silas stepped out onto the porch, his rifle held loosely in his hand. "Coulter." "I'm here as a courtesy," the sheriff said, finally swinging down from his horse. "Not as the law. The law's not going to be much help to you in what's coming." He looked past Silas, to where Lena stood in the shadowed doorway. "The preacher, Gideon Blackwood. He's been whipping them up into a frenzy, him and the dead man's family. They're saying Croft was murdered in cold blood while trying to save that girl's soul." "Croft drew on me," Silas said, his voice flat. "I believe you," Coulter said with a sigh. "But it ain't what I believe that matters. There's a group of them, men from Blackwood's congregation, some of Croft's kin. They've been drinking all day at the saloon, talking about righteous justice. They're coming, Silas, tonight, and they're armed." He shook his head, his expression a mixture of pity and frustration. "They ain't coming for a trial. They're coming to see you and the girl both swing from a tree." The sheriff tipped his hat. "I've said my piece. I'd advise you to ride hard and fast and don't look back, but I know you won't." He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving his words to hang in the heavy afternoon air like the promise of a death sentence. When he was gone, Silas turned to Lena. For the first time, he saw not just fear in her eyes, but a new, hard resolution. The time for running was over. He didn't tell her to hide. He didn't tell her to flee. He started to prepare. He spent the last hours of daylight turning his home into a fortress. He boarded up the single window, leaving only a small slit to shoot through. He brought buckets of water inside, in case they tried to burn the cabin. Then he went outside, into the woods that surrounded his land, his movements quick and purposeful. He set traps along the main path leading to the cabin, a deadfall made of a heavy log, tripwires made of vine that would not be seen in the dark. He used the terrain he knew better than any other man alive, turning the forest into an ally. Lena watched him, her heart a tight, painful knot in her chest. He was going to die for her. He was going to stand against a dozen men, maybe more, to protect her. A woman he would not touch, a woman whose questions he would not answer. He would die for her body, but he would not let her near his soul. As the sun began to set, casting long, bloody fingers of light through the trees, he came back inside. The cabin was dark, lit only by a single, low-burning lantern. He checked his rifle, then his pistol, laying out extra cartridges on the table. The air was thick with the smell of gun oil and impending violence. Lena came to him then. She stood before him, her hands clasped in front of her, her face pale but her eyes steady. "They are coming here to kill us," she said. It was not a question. He nodded, his eyes not leaving his work. "I don't want to die tomorrow," she said, her voice a low, trembling whisper. "Having never known what it is to be held, to choose." He stopped what he was doing and finally looked at her. He saw the desperate plea in her eyes, and he understood. This was not about lust. This was about life. It was about finding a single moment of grace, a flicker of warmth, before the final, cold darkness. It was about two people clinging to each other on the edge of a cliff, not for passion, but for the simple, profound affirmation that they were alive. "Lena, no!" he started, his voice rough with his own internal conflict. She stepped forward and placed a hand on his cheek, her touch silencing him. "Please," she whispered, "don't let me die a stranger, and don't you die one either." He looked into her eyes, and, for the first time, the walls he had spent 7 years building finally began to crumble. The guilt, the ghost of his wife, the self-hatred. It was all still there, but for a moment, her need was stronger. Her trust was a balm on his raw soul. Slowly, as if in a trance, he set the gun down. He raised his hand and covered hers, his rough, calloused skin a stark contrast to her own. He leaned into her touch, and a shudder went through his powerful frame. It was a surrender, He led her to the cot. There was no hurried passion, no frantic tearing of clothes. It was a slow, tender, and heartbreakingly gentle exploration. He removed her dress with a reverence that made her want to weep. He mapped the bruises on her soul with his fingertips. He kissed her with a quiet desperation, as if he were drinking from a spring after a lifetime of thirst. The salt on her lips was from her own tears, tears of fear and gratitude and a strange, painful joy. For Lena, it was the discovery of an uncharted territory, a place she had only known through fear and shame. But with him, there was no pain, only a slow, deliberate tenderness. He was patient, gentle, teaching her that a man's touch could be a comfort, not a threat. For Silas, it was an act of both healing and sacrilege. Every touch was a betrayal of the memory of his wife, and yet every touch was also a step back into the world of the living. It was not a taking, but a giving, a final, desperate offering of what little humanity they had left to each other before the fight. They came together in the lantern-lit darkness, two broken people finding a fleeting, fragile wholeness in each other's arms. Their silent union a defiant cry against the violent world that was coming to claim them at dawn. Dawn did not arrive with the gentle blush of a new day, but as a slow, merciless leak of gray light into the oppressive darkness. It was a killer's light, revealing the world in stark, unforgiving detail. Inside the cabin, Silas and Lena were already awake. They had not slept. They had dressed in the dark, moving with a grim, silent purpose. The tender intimacy of the night had evaporated, leaving behind a hard, metallic resolve. He had handed her his spare pistol, a heavy, solid weight in her hands, and shown her how to use it. Now, they waited. The first sound was the nervous whicker of a horse, quickly shushed. Then another, the faint jingle of a bridle. They were coming on foot, using the trees and the charred skeleton of the barn for cover. Silas stood by the boarded-up window, a rifle in his hands, his body a study, in lethal stillness. Lena was crouched by the hearth, the cold weight of the pistol a terrible anchor in her lap. The silence in the cabin was a living thing, a coiled snake, its only sound the frantic, bird-like flutter of Lena's own heart. A voice, rough and emboldened by whiskey, cut through the pre-dawn gloom. "Cain, send out the harlot. We've come for what's ours. We've come for God's justice." It was Preacher Blackwood's voice, but stripped of its pulpit resonance. It was just the ugly snarl of a mob leader. Silas didn't answer. He waited. A shot rang out, then another, splintering the heavy oak of the door. The siege had begun. The next hour was a blur of deafening noise, acrid smoke, and splintering wood. Muzzle flashes lit the gray morning like demonic fireflies. Silas was a machine. He moved from the window's slit to a chink in the log wall, firing with an economy of motion that was both terrifying and magnificent. He was not a man fighting for his life. He was a force of nature, a cornered grizzly defending its territory. He never wasted a shot. A cry from the trees would follow each deafening report from his rifle. Lena huddled by the fire, reloading the spare pistol as he had shown her, her hands shaking so violently she could barely fit the cartridges into the cylinder. The world had shrunk to this one room, this one man, this one all-consuming storm of violence. They were getting bolder, creeping closer under the cover of the constant gunfire. Silas was breathing hard now, a thin line of sweat cutting through the grime on his forehead. A bullet tore through the wall, inches from his head, showering his face with wood splinters. He grunted and fired back. And then it happened. As he moved back to the window, a volley of shots ripped through the boarded-up frame. One of them found its mark. Silas cried out, a sharp, guttural sound of pain, and staggered back, clutching his left shoulder. A dark, wet stain was already spreading across his shirt. The rifle clattered to the floor. "Silas!" Lena screamed, scrambling toward him. "Stay down," he snarled, trying to raise his pistol with his good hand. His face pale and slick with sweat. His left arm hung uselessly at his side. He was wounded, vulnerable. From outside, a triumphant shout. "He's hit! I saw him go down! I'm going around the back!" Through a crack in the wall, Lena saw a man break from the cover of the trees. He was a big, bearded man, his face flushed with a righteous fury. He was running toward the back of the cabin, toward the small, unbarred storeroom door. He would be on them in seconds. Silas was struggling to his feet, trying to get a clear shot, but he was too slow, his vision blurring with pain. In that moment, something shifted in Lena. The terror that had paralyzed her for a lifetime was burned away by a new, white-hot fire. It was the image of Silas falling, the thought of this man, this animal, bursting through the door to finish him. The world went silent. All she could see was the running man. All she could feel was the cold, heavy weight of the pistol in her hand. She rose to her knees, raising the gun with both hands to steady it. She did not aim so much as point it, her entire being focused on that single, hateful target. She squeezed her eyes shut and pulled the trigger. The gun bucked in her hands, the sound a deafening explosion in the small cabin. She did not see the man fall. She only heard a choked, surprised grunt, and then the heavy thud of a body hitting the soft earth. She opened her eyes. The man was lying on the ground, still and silent. The world rushed back in, a roaring flood of sound and sensation, the smell of gunpowder, the ringing in her ears, the sight of the man she had just killed. Her stomach revolted. A violent, acidic wave rose in her throat, and she turned and vomited onto the dirt floor, her body convulsing with ragged, tearing sobs. The firing from outside faltered, the attackers confused by the shot from a new angle. Silas used the lull. He crawled to her, his good arm wrapping around her shaking shoulders, pulling her away from the mess. "It's all right," he rasped, his voice thick with pain. "You're all right. You saved me. Lena." He held her, his own blood dripping onto the floor beside them, and in that moment of shared violence and visceral horror, they were no longer a man and a woman, a protector and a victim. They were two soldiers in the same trench, bound by blood and gunpowder. The attack broke after that. The sight of another fallen man, and the realization that there were two guns in the cabin, had shattered their drunken courage. They gathered their dead and wounded and retreated back into the woods, their righteous crusade ending in a bloody, ignominious failure. An hour later, as the sun finally cleared the ridge, Sheriff Coulter arrived. He was not alone. He had a deputy and the town doctor with him. He was too late to stop the fight, but he was in time to read its story. He saw the bullet-riddled cabin, the bodies of the two attackers who had been left behind, the wounded Silas, and the pale, shell-shocked girl. He saw the truth written in the blood and the splintered wood. This was not a murder. This was a siege. The trial was held a month later in Haven's Follies Saloon, the only building large enough to hold the crowd. The town was a powder keg of division. Families who had known Silas for years stood by him, while the pious and the self-righteous, whipped into a frenzy by Preacher Blackwood, saw only a killer and a whore. Lena sat beside Silas at a makeshift table, her hands folded in her lap, her face a pale, impassive mask. Preacher Blackwood was the star witness for the prosecution. He took the stand, his black coat a symbol of his authority, his voice booming through the silent, crowded room. He spoke of hellfire and damnation. He painted Lena as a serpent in the garden, a temptress who had fled her sacred duty to her family and church, a woman so steeped in sin that she had led one good man to his death and turned another into a monster. He used scripture as a weapon, twisting verses of purity and obedience into a condemnation that was as much for the town as it was for Lena. "Suffer not a witch to live," he thundered, his eyes blazing, and a murmur of agreement rippled through one side of the room. When it was Silas's turn to testify, a hush fell over the saloon. He walked to the stand slowly, his left arm in a sling, his face grim. He was not a man of words, and the entire town knew it. He was sworn in, and he looked not at the prosecutor, not at the jury of grim-faced miners and merchants, but directly at Lena. He told them about the attack on the cabin, his voice low and steady, each word a carefully placed stone. He told them how Lena had saved his life. Then he paused, and the air in the room grew thick with anticipation. "This ain't about that morning," he said, his voice dropping even lower, yet carrying to every corner of the room. "This started a long time ago for me." He took a deep breath, and it seemed to cost him everything. 7 years ago, I had a wife. Her name was Sarah. A gasp went through the crowd. He had never spoken her name to any of them. I left her alone at the cabin. I was gone a day longer than I planned, and when I came back, she was dead. Murdered. She was carrying my child. He finally broke his gaze from Lena and looked at the jury, his eyes burning with a self-inflicted pain that was more powerful than any preacher's sermon. "I lost one woman because I didn't act, because I wasn't there when I should have been. I have lived with that every single day for 7 years. He turned his gaze back to Lena, and his voice, for the first time, was raw with an emotion that no one had ever heard from him. "This woman, Lena Whitmore, came to my door half dead. She was running from a life that was a prison. This town, this church, men like Abner Croft, they wanted to own her, to break her. I stood in the way, and I would do it again. I lost one woman because I didn't act. I won't lose another. Ooze." He stood up, his testimony finished. The silence in the saloon was absolute. He had not offered a defense. He had offered a confession, a reason, a declaration. He had laid his own broken soul bare for all to see. The jury was out for less than an hour. They came back with a verdict of innocent, on all counts, for both of them. A cheer went up from one side of the room, met by angry jeers from the other. Preacher Gideon Blackwood, his face a mask of thunderous fury, stormed out of the saloon, followed by his congregation. He left town the next day, his power broken, his hypocrisy exposed. But the victory was a hollow one. Though cleared by the law, Silas was now a pariah in the eyes of many. He was the man who had aired his private grief, who had killed to protect an outsider. He and Lena were marked. The town was no longer a home. It was a cage filled with judging eyes. They made their decision that night, without needing to speak of it. There was nothing left for them here but ghosts and bad memories. They packed what little they had: his guns, his saddle, a few tools, a single cast-iron skillet, her spare dress, the worn Bible she still carried but never read. They left the cabin to the mountains, its bullet-pocked walls a silent monument to their trial. With Boulder carrying their supplies and a new horse Silas had bought for Lena, they rode west toward the setting sun, toward a land with no name and no memory. They traveled for a week, putting miles and mountains between them and their past. They spoke little, but the silence was different now. It was a shared peace, the quiet understanding of two people who had been forged into something new in the same fire. One night, they made camp in a high mountain meadow. The sky was a breathtaking canopy of stars, a spill of diamond dust across black velvet. The only sound was the crackle of the campfire and the gentle sigh of the wind through the pines. They sat side by side, sharing a blanket, watching the fire. Lena leaned her head on his good shoulder. The question had been sitting in her heart, a single, unanswered note in a finished song. She had to know. "You never answered me," she whispered, her breath a small, white puff in the cold air. "That night, in the cabin, before they came." He turned his head, his rough cheek brushing against her hair. He looked at her, and in the soft firelight, she could see the truth in his eyes, a truth more profound than any words he had ever spoken. His voice, when he finally replied, was hoarse with an emotion held back for a lifetime. "I did," he said softly. "I just didn't think I deserved you yet." A slow, brilliant smile spread across Lena's face. It was a smile of pure, unburdened grace. It was the smile of a woman who had found her answer not in a word, but in 1,000 actions. He had answered her with every bullet he fired, with every step he took, with every beat of his guarded heart. She leaned in and kissed him, a soft, sure kiss of promises made and kept. They turned their faces back to the fire, 2 survivors, 2 partners, riding into the vast, unknown country, choosing each other, no matter what came. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the American West. Please comment with where you are listening from to connect with fellow fans. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.